The Battle of Fromelles took place in northern France on the 19th of July 1916. It resulted in the deaths of over 4,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers, who were buried in a mass grave and forgotten. Since 2009, LGC scientists have worked alongside the Commonwealth War Graves Commission and Oxford Archaeology to identify fallen soldiers using DNA analysis.
The grave had initially been identified a number of years ago. People in Australia were very interested in finding this mass grave because they knew that a significant number of people had died at the Battle of Fromelles and were buried somewhere there. Each of these mass graves had about 70 soldiers in them, and the Germans had laid them out in a sort of a formalised fashion. They weren't just chucked in there. You could see that they were very carefully laid out. But the anthropologists who had to do the work, they were doing this in midsummer, so it was very hot, and we'd actually ensured that they wore protective clothing because we need to ensure that they weren't going to contaminate the samples with their own DNA. So at the beginning of the project, we insisted that they wore protective clothing, masks, gloves, hat. All in midsummer, they were having to wear those clothes, and so it was very uncomfortable conditions for them to be recovering the bodies, because these bodies were in, as Vicar said, in clay, and so they would have to use things like gardening trowels to very carefully take the soil and the clay away from each body, because they didn't want to interfere with the body at all. They didn't want it to get disrupted, so they had to uncover each body very carefully. And we needed at that stage, so for the pilot stage, we needed samples from these bodies, and at this stage these soldiers, they fell and were buried nearly 100 years ago, so obviously these bodies are going to be in a very poor state. So at that stage, nobody had any idea whether there was any usable DNA in any of those bodies, so it was pertinent to carry out a pilot study just to find out the status of the DNA in a subset of these soldiers.
We were successful in obtaining DNA from a majority part of the samples that were processed. It gave us an initiative and put in a strategy of which type of samples in particular that were providing better DNA. So with that information involved, we would then be able to provide that information to the archaeologists on site for them to then be able to subsample specific types of samples for us. And we were able to get DNA profiles from, I think it was, mitochondrial DNA from all the soldiers from that pilot part of this project, and majority of YSTR profiles from quite a few of them. YSTR profiling comes from an area of DNA which we're interested in, which comes in lineage from the male DNA side. So when a boy is born, for example, you only inherit the Y part chromosome from the father. So it's identical, it carried on, passed through generation to generation. And when we're looking at a project like this, it gives us that extra information which you wouldn't have if you were looking at close relatives to today, where the DNA potentially could be degraded. So we can look further generations apart. And for mitochondrial DNA profiling, it's what part of the DNA that's inherited on the maternal line. So it goes from mother to child, and so therefore you can get it on the male side as well. So if a mum had a boy, he would inherit the same mitochondrial DNA profile as his mum, and so therefore we can go back the generations through on the maternal side. And maternal DNA is really quite nice actually, because you can then look at it in a visual type of format. So if you sort of think of it a bit like a comb, and each of the teeth are in different types of colours, in particular you get that DNA profile and you want to match it up to somebody else, we can then just try and fit that comb in place on top of each other, and then you can see whether you observe a match or not based on that.
The significant matches tend to be where you've got the combined matches. You've got a YSTR profile and a mitochondrial profile from the same family which matches up to a soldier. That's where you get a match in the order of the millions. But sometimes you would have family trees where you didn't have that availability of both the maternal and paternal aspects of the family, and so you're reliant on maybe just a paternal side or a mitochondrial side. If you had the paternal side, the YSTR profile, that tends to be more discriminating than the mitochondrial side. So we would be providing matches where you got what we call intermediate information, But then when say the data analysis team that look at all the evidence, they've got other information, making determinations of how old the soldier was. They had all the artefacts that were coming up from the excavation to do with uniforms, personal possessions. Then they could add that into that DNA result and come up with a proper formal identification.
The Battle of Fromelles was the first major battle fought by Australian troops in the First World War. In just a day, Australia experienced over 5,000 casualties. The battle has subsequently become known as the worst 24 hours in Australian history. It is still extremely important to the Australian people.
When we were saying we have communications from some of the family members, they would be sending us emails with photographs in, explain to them about who their family was, and that whole humane aspect part of the project hit home really. From the types of samples that we will be receiving, so mainly we wanted to have teeth samples. It's a lot less easier. It was a lot easier for us to process, and obviously teeth are that bit more special because the enamel that's based on the teeth actually protects the DNA. So it's for us, it's a good type of sample for us to take. So we would take a tooth sample and then we would then clean it because we want to remove any potential DNA that's available. And then you would then take that tooth and we place it into a special type of machine with liquid nitrogen, and it then allows us to cool the sample down and then crush it, so then we can make like a powder solution, and that makes it a lot easier for us to then try and extract the DNA from the tooth. We would then put that into a number of types of chemical processes to try to clean it up and further extract the DNA, and once we've done that part, we would then purify it to try to concentrate the DNA up, because we're talking really low levels of DNA. These are 100 years old samples. So we're trying to optimize as much of our process as possible so that we can get a DNA concentration that we could then be able to get a DNA profile from.
During the first year of the project, LGC helped to identify 96 soldiers. In total, 144 of the 250 buried soldiers have been identified since 2009.
I think that prior to this final year, every expectation was it was just going to be stopped, nothing else. And we were going to be getting ready to hand over all our databases and everything back to be sort of archived. But I think that there are people out there that actually realise that there's always an opportunity still to identify these soldiers, that we've created the database, we've got the information about each of those 250 soldiers, so now it's just reliant on further samples being processed, and because we've got the expertise to do that processing and we hold the databases, then we're in a privileged position. We can continue having that part to play in it. So I think for myself and Vic, that's certainly makes us pleased to be at LGC continuing with this project.